Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much. I'm Farina Mir. I'm the director of the Center for South Asian Studies, and I would like to make a couple of announcements before I host today's speaker. The first is to ask you to please do us the courtesy of filling out your evaluation form before you leave this afternoon, and you can leave it by the door. The second announcement really is about some upcoming events that I am as excited about as I am about today's speaker. So next Friday in this space is going to be the third Michigan-Pakistan Conference, which is this year co-sponsored, co-hosted by the Center for South Asian Studies and the Pakistan Students Association. We have a number of eminent scholars coming in for this, and the conference is going to run from 11 to 5 p.m. The conference schedule has gone out from the center, but if you need it, just let us know. We'll give you more details. Among the people, and we have some handouts right by the door. Thanks, Silka. So among the people that we are expecting next week are Mariam Mufti from the University of Oklahoma, Sadia Tur from the College of Staten Island, Aisha Jalal from Tufts University, Jim Cavallaro from Stanford Law School, Madiha Tahir, who's an independent journalist, and Anjum Altaf from the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Lahore. So it's an eclectic group, but I think it promises to be a really interesting day. The following week, which is April 11th, 12th, co-hosted with the Islamic Studies program, we have Manan Ahmed for a Thursday afternoon seminar and a Friday afternoon talk, to which Ashwin Punatham Baker, who was here a second ago, will be responding. And our final event for the semester will be on April 19th, where Ashish Rajadaksha is joining us. And he will be actually talking, we now know, about India's Aadhaar program, the monitoring, shall we call it, of its citizens. So we have a really full month of April, but that brings me around to today. It is really my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Firdous Azim from BRAC University in Dhaka, where she is a professor and chairperson of the Department of English and Humanities. Professor Azim received her BA with honors in English from the University of Dhaka, as well as her MA, and she received her PhD from the University of Sussex. She has taught both at the University of Dhaka and has had visiting positions in a number of institutions. And she's been the recipient of a number of awards, including an Asian Studies Fellowship at Stockholm Universities, Fulbright, Commonwealth Fellowships, Ford Foundation Fellowships. And one of the real pleasures of having Dr. Azim in residence this week, quite honestly, has been, getting an opportunity to know her a little bit, but also really getting a sense, as it's these things are always represented on a CV and sometimes not manifest always as such, but your range is remarkable. She is a scholar of English literature. She is an activist who works with NGOs. She is a women's studies scholar, and she's also an avid interlocutor on Bangladesh's politics. Today she'll be talking to us. Her paper is entitled Women Writing in Early 20th Century Bengal, Contesting the Formation of a New National Identity. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Farina, for those very kind words and this very wonderful invitation to the University of Michigan and the Center for South Asian Studies. I've been here for the week, and I've had a great time meeting people, being part of Farina's class on South Asia, and generally, I think it's been a wonderful experience, and access to the library has also been of great use to me. So thank you all, and thank you for being here, and I hope that you enjoy what I'm going to say. and that it is of some worth, because this is work in progress. A colleague of mine, Professor Parveen Hassan, and I are working on what we have entitled very ambitiously the cultural history of women in Bengal or in Bangladesh. But at the moment, I'm just going to read out of this work in progress something that has become, I think, a slightly better title than the one I sent here. It's Language, Literature, Education and Community, the Muslim Bengali Woman in the Early 20th Century. So in this paper, I'm going to concentrate on women and writings about women in a host of journals that began to appear in the early 20th century, edited by Muslim intellectuals and writers. So they were mainly published from Calcutta, but also from Dhaka. Early 20th century Bengal witnessed a plethora of Muslim-edited journals, which provided, amongst other things, a platform for Muslim women to write and to enter a debate on the formations of a Bengali identity. This presentation will look at the construction of the modern Bengali Muslim woman and the connections that can be drawn between the formation of this identity and the emergence of a notion of a Bengali nation. In broad outline, I will see how the main contours of this nation, based as it was on religious, community, and linguistic affiliations, were being delineated. Identity, both at the individual or community national level, was fluid, as its various dimensions were foregrounded at different times. The road to nationhood was also envisaged as part of the path to modernity, and the lines that define modernity were also shifting, and the grounds that the envisaged modern nation occupied continuously reformed and reconstituted. Let us briefly examine the concept of modernity and link it to the larger issue of language and gender. Often posed as the opposite of tradition, this binary posits religion against secularism, superstition against science, and in a colonial situation as in Bengal, makes a demarcation between the private and public spheres. This dichotomy has been shown in a gendered fashion famously by Partha Chatterjee, pitting the woman on the side of the traditional. This division can also be extended to the use of language, especially when we try to define literary language. Literature written in Bengali was seen as emblematic of the nation, hence a public expression. But literature is also the expression of innermost desires, and as such, it is the most private of all expressions. The language of literature thus straddles both public and private spheres, and may be comparable to the cultural positioning of women. The issue of language and women can easily be juxtaposed to delineate the fluctuations in the processes of modern nation-making. Apparently dissimilar in the oscillation between the colonial or modern public and the traditional domestic sphere, both women and language occupy a crucial and anomalous position. So in this presentation today, I will try to juxtapose these 2 points and look at how the emerging Bengali Muslim literati were looking at these. So the journals that we will be looking at are involved in a debate about the configurations of the emerging nation and provide a new platform for writing led by Muslims in the nation-making discourse. These journals highlighted the issue of language, Bengali, trying to forge a bridge between the Sanskritized written version as it existed then with the more colloquial spoken one. Am I too close to the mic? I know. The divide between the formal and the colloquial was at that time largely configured as a communal one, that is, as a difference between the language used by Hindus and Muslims. There was also a class dimension that determined the differences in the use of language, as the upper-class educated Muslims spoke and wrote a lot in Urdu, and colloquial Bengali remained the language of the largely peasant masses. So I'll begin the presentation by looking at one particular journal called Naur and its inaugural editorial. The examination of women's writings will thus be placed within this larger sphere, and the aim will be to see how women were positioned both as markers of a modern identity and whether they deviated from established notions in their own writing. An apt site to begin would be the editorial of the first issue of Naur. Editor Maulvi Sayyid Imdad Ali, introducing the journal in 1903, urges his fellow Bengalis to, and I quote, and the translations are ours, shape the Bengali language and give it a new form. This project, he goes on to say, would enrich the language by, quote again, incorporating invaluable gems from older Arabic and Persian literature. This is accompanied by a call for communal harmony, and so inviting Hindu writers to be sympathetic to Muslims and to join with them in this project of reshaping the Bengali language. The third and perhaps most significant address is to women with a call to participate. In very typical language, it says, "Today we call upon all our women folk who are within the Antapur or the private living quarters to participate in our literary activities and contribute to the glow of Naur. Within the family, they nurture us with their motherly care, sisterly affection, and tender wifely love. Will they not similarly assist us in our literary efforts and lead the nation to greater development?" So this is a very impassioned call. This editorial, which can be seen as a manifestation or a manifesto for the emergence of the new Bengali Muslim nation, highlights three tasks. First is the undertaking to reflect a Muslim heritage in the Bengali language itself, i.e. to claim a position as writers in Bengali with a Muslim heritage. The centuries-long Muslim rule accounts for the percolations of Arabic and Persian and the vocabulary and literary heritage of Bengal. The second point tries to mitigate this sentiment and states that the call is not meant to be divisive, as it invites Hindus to cooperate in the creation of a more inclusive Bengali language and literature. Solidarity and sympathy between the communities would result in the creation of a new Bengali, it feels. Finally, there's the appeal to women. Although couched in terms of their familial responsibilities, the invitation makes clear that the new Bengali was very aware of the gender dimensions of the emerging sense of nation. Let us now look at the responses to this call. The first one, for a secular community, expresses a desire rather than reflects the reality of the existing relationship between the two communities. This desire remains unfulfilled, as by the third issue of the same year, 1903, the editorial expresses disappointment with the Hindu response to the invitation. To quote, it says, "It would be foolish to expect the nation that calls itself Bhadro or Gentile to the exclusion of all others and claims all honor and respect for itself to write a fair history of those belonging to other religions and communities." End quote. By the third issue, the thorny relationship between Hindus and Muslims in Bengal begins to surface. It is interesting that much of this divide or conflict between Hindus and Muslims are expressed in gendered terms. It is based on, at least in Naur, the debate is introduced through talking about articles that talk about the castigating Islam for its treatment of women. So one of the review articles in the very first issue is an essay entitled Hindu Narir Musulman Ghrina, or Hindu Women's Hatred of Muslims, and which critiques a prize-winning article, Child Marriage and the Parda System, written by a Srimati Shama Sundari Devi, which was published in Savitri, which was an anthology of essays published that year. This essay, says Haq, echoes the prejudices contained in much Bengali writing, reflecting prejudice against and ignorance about Muslims. There's no knowledge or understanding of Muslim culture, which he claims preaches dignity and rights of women, while making a case for the simple Islamic principles which guide Muslim lives. Speaking against Shama Sundari, Haq points out that even though Muslim women live in Parda, they enjoy rights enjoined on them by Islam, which are greater than those given to Hindu women. The freedom and dignity of Muslim women cannot be understood, he maintains, by people who are not familiar with basic Islamic principles. He accuses Hindus of ignorance of a Muslim way of life and Islamic teachings and principles. That this ignorance is one-sided is shown by his citations from misogynistic Hindu religious texts, which, he says, depict women as slaves under the total control of men. By the third issue, the editorial is clearly disappointed at the Hindu response to its call for unity. But it's interesting, nonetheless, that the debate should be around the treatment and position of women in the two communities. The second quest, that for a Muslim contribution to Bengali language and literature, is also very interesting. This quest was not for a distinct language. It was based on Bengali itself, but for a distinct literary tradition. Again, in 1903, there's an article entitled Musalmani Literature in Bengali by Abdul Karim, who calls on Bengali Muslims to write in Bengali rather than the Urdu, Persian, and Arabic of their ancestors. He draws attention to the fact that Muslims had always written their tales and stories in Bengal, a language in which a Muslim literature already existed. The debate here then is not regarding the language of literary expression, which is naturally assumed to be Bengali, but for a literary tradition separate from the mainstream or Bhadralok mainstream, which can be traced through a body of text in Bengali, which can then lay claim to a Bengali linguistic tradition. The kind of metaphors that are used to discuss the Muslim influence in Bengali language and literature is indeed interesting. I'll go to a long quote now, and which says, "The signs of Muslim rule in Bengali culture and language is permanently etched. If Sanskrit is the mother of Bengali, then its nurse is Persian, as Muslim languages have helped to develop and nourish the starved form of the Bengali language. The language that we use today was not born in this shape. It has acquired its present form through the nurturing care of both its mother and nurse. Thus, we may think that it has lost its purity of form, but that does not mean that it has lost its character. Rather than lose its character, its emaciated form has been enriched and now has a healthy and rich appearance." And this healthy and rich appearance that the Muslim is supposed to add to the Bengali occurs all through the pages of these journals. Thus, Muslims, having contributed to the rejuvenation of the Bengali language, must take their strong claim on it. The need to remember the past is reiterated here, and the flourishing of Bengali literature under the patronage of the Muslim sultans during the 15th and 16th centuries recollected. There is in Bengal a great debate regarding the so-called Bengal Renaissance of the mid-19th century. Despite all the historical revaluations of the period by historians such as Sumit Sarkar, etc., its literary achievements nevertheless remains unchallenged. It is within these pages that you find a challenge to even its literary credentials. Any history of Bengali literature, in fact, any syllabus of Bengali literature, traces Bengali modernity to the writings of Bankim Chatterjee and Madhusudan Dutt and sees the seeds of the modern Bengali language as having been sown in the mid-19th century. Yet there's room for rethinking the literary aspects of the Renaissance as well. Writers in this journal, such as Abdul Karim Sahitya Bisharad, ask, did not a Renaissance happen earlier in the courts of the sultans? In an article entitled Literary Renaissance of Bengali Muslims, he says that the mid-19th century Renaissance had no relevance for the Bengali Muslim. The problem for Bengali Muslims in forging their own Renaissance lies, according to Abdul Karim, in the disconnect with their Muslim heritage. He cites North Indian Urdu literature as an example of a Muslim literary Renaissance. In this regard, Bengali Muslims need to assert their position and forge their own trajectory, which will endow Bengali literature with the same richness and diversity that is to be found in Bengali life. So this is the way that a separate Bengali Muslim stream of writing is being delineated and sought for. And the final call in the editorial to women of writers did not go unanswered. And we find many women, including the famous Rokia Sakhawat Hussain, writing extensively for Nour. Rokia Sakhawat Hussain is somewhat of an iconic figure in Bengali feminist history as the mother of all feminisms, etc., etc. And most importantly, she's a great writer. In 1904, Rokia published an article called Amader Obonoti, or Our Downfall, which took on many of the themes that she had used in an earlier publication. She concentrates on the theme of jewelry and women's display of their husband's wealth on their person as a sign of women's subordination, lamenting how women revel in their enslavement. The theme of enslavement, both mental and physical, makes a connection between the mind and body. Typically, the essay draws a realistic, typically for Rokia that is, but satirical picture of an aristocratic bride, weighed down by tons of jewelry, heavy clothing, and elaborate makeup. Immobile and tied down in her finery, the body of the woman becomes a symbol of enslavement. Thus, women responded positively to the call in the editorial and indeed enhanced the glow of Naur. But instead of dwelling on sectarian interests, Rokia and her sister writers draw attention to the plight of women and they call for reform in women's position. Other women writers include Khairunisa Khatun from Rokia is like writing from Calcutta, the center of Bengali writing, and Khairunisa Khatun writes from a small town called Sirajganj in East Bengal. So there's a host of writings. But it's amazing how Rokia's essay Amader Obonuti was taken, and I found this very amusing. So I'm going to quote to you by an essay Al-Musawi, who really is very unhappy with Rokia. He questions the type of education that Rokia is advocating for women. He begins by saying that Rokia's recommendations are not clear, and later comments that the type of education that she's recommending is too Western. The problem with this European type of education, he thinks, is that it will make women totally unfit for marriage, as they would never be proper housewives in a Bengali household, and no European suitors were waiting for them. Thus, they would be spending a lifetime of loneliness and despair. So anyway, Rokia's writings on education were not the typical thing of creating the perfect Bhadra Mahila for the Bhadra Lok or the perfect wife for the new man, but was talking about this new independent woman, and there you get the criticism. So. And the responses to Rokia, not only from men but also from women, were very vitriolic. Mahua Sarkar, in her book, has commented on Hindu reactions to Rokia's writing, saying that Rokia was always looked on as a representative of a community that was specially harsh and vindictive and oppressive towards its women. She did not think that a woman would write like this because Hindu women were worshipped as goddesses and not interred within the household. So there's a gendered criticism and a communal criticism of Rokia's writing going on immediately in the early 20th century. Rokia's writing, and particularly this essay, is not merely an angry diatribe. It is a call to women to wake up and realize the roots of their oppression. Rokia thinks that women's compliance with societal norms would only worsen their subordinate position. She turns to education as the remedy for the societal ills that women suffer. While debating the efficacies of women's education, she does not repeat the Bhodro or the mainstream formula of creating adequate wives for the new man. And not only is that available in so-called Hindu writing, but also in Muslim writing. You have novels such as Anwara, Abdullah, all of which debate the new man and the new woman, and they're always seen as mirror images of each other and as companions to each other. Somehow this writer seems to be taking off in an independent direction. She thinks that every woman must live up to her human potential. Otherwise, how was she to answer to the Creator on the day of judgment? Quote, if God does a stock-taking and asks her, have you used your mind, brain, eyes, etc. well? What will the Begum say in reply? And she goes on to say that people make fun of women entering the job market, but Rokia sees nothing wrong in that. Despite all the caricatures, she does not hesitate to envisage lady clerks, barristers, or even a lady viceroy. She justifies her choice of professions by asserting that as these are professions open to men, there's no reason for barring women from aspiring to them. She states in the article that knowledge, which will be the source of mental and physical freedom, is not only contained in books and texts, and here she includes the religious texts, but is to be acquired through real-life experiences, the use of one's God-given intelligence. And then again in inspiring words, she goes on, therefore, sister, where the uneducated eye sees mud, the educated eye sees him. How will we justify to Khuda the fact that we forever refuse to see? Despite her iconoclasm, Rokia does not hesitate to use religious and otherworldly arguments to bolster her call for women's advancement. She says that women will take their position not only by adhering to religion, but by exercising by their own reason and innate talents, and then the doors of heaven would open for them. The use of terms such as God-given or doors of heaven keep the religious tenor of the discourse intact, even while criticizing the religious limitations imposed on women. Rokia's social critique sets her apart from contemporary writers as the reform she calls for embraces women's social, mental, and physical emancipation, independent of her domestic role as a companion for the educated husband. Ironic, and this essay, as we have said, has been read as Taslima Nasreen's works are read till today, as the lone voice of a woman writing from a very conservative and oppressive community. And despite conservative and backwardness, Rokia's voice is not a lone voice, but is part of a clamor of voices for women's freedom, as we shall go on to see, and for the recasting of women in a modern garb. In order to recast women in a modern garb, Rokia draws on a world that goes far beyond Bengal. Just as the contemporary colonial world is reflected in the choice of professions and in her references to Western civilization, she also draws examples from the Muslim world, occasionally quoting from the Urdu journals that she had been reading, none of which, unfortunately for us, she refers to by name. She brings in examples from Turkey as well as other parts of India in her reference to Parsi women, for example. Citing from an unnamed Urdu journal, Rokia draws on the example of the changes in the lives of Parsi women and says that despite all the prognostications of social collapse, their progress had not affected society in a negative manner. So I say, why don't you all for once move forward on the road towards freedom together? She, in fact, thinks that women in other Muslim countries had contributed to society and knowledge, and it is only the Bengali Muslim woman who lags behind. Lag is a word that constantly comes up in delineations of the Bengali Muslim in the early 20th century. Usually the lag is traced to, in relation to Hindus, both men and women, in Bengal. Rokia casts her vision beyond Bengal and shows that the lag is in fact a Bengali one, not necessarily just Muslim. Another essay of Rokia's called Burqa, written in 1904, seems to be a plea for veiling. However, the essay looks at the same issues as the earlier one of education and mobility for girls and women. She opines the piece of clothing that is known as the burqa is not an impediment for women, and that women can achieve everything even within its confines. And this seems to be something that goes on during that period, and even now, I suppose. What she continues to protest against is the extreme of the artificial dimensions of parda. She talks of improving the burqa, designing it to be more comfortable and pleasing to the eye, etc. And nowhere in her writings have I found Rokia talking about the modern woman as being the ideal wife for the menfolk. And on the other hand, even in this essay, she reiterates that women need to be educated not for the sake of men, but because social development cannot be complete if half the society is left outside the light of education. So she asks her brothers to use the money they spend on their daughter's jewelry to establish women's schools instead. Rokia, as said earlier, is not the only woman to have responded to Nour's call for women writers. A lesser-known writer is Khairunisa Khatun, who writes from Sirajganj and was also published in Nour between the years 1904 and 5. I'll take out from her essay called Shodeshu Norag, or For the Love of Motherland, which makes a plea for the rights of women to participate in political matters. Both women, Rokia and Khairun-Nessa, take advantage of the call to women writers made in the first editorial to establish women's claim to all spheres of public life. Rokia's impassioned plea for women to become magistrates and barristers is now accompanied by Khairun-Nessa's call for women to participate directly in political matters. In a rare article by a Muslim against the partition of Bengal, she calls on her sisters to participate with their brothers, husbands, and fathers in a cause which will determine the fate of the nation. Despite the use of familial terms, sisters, wives, and daughters helping their male relatives, women are called into the struggle as they have the equal right to participate in these matters. She emphasizes that it is again wrong for women to sit idle at this time of great revolution. The revolution itself is domesticated, with the reiteration of the familiar Swadeshi call for giving up foreign articles of clothing as well as goods for household use. Although Khairun-Nessa's call to give up jewelry echoes that of Rokia's, this call for sacrifice is in the service of the nation. Nour's call to women writers was made in a spirit of inclusiveness and acknowledgement, and was accompanied and was responded to by articles that debated the position of Muslim vis-a-vis Hindu women. Women's own response to this call went far beyond these concerns and envisaged a larger, richer world for women, drawing them into the spheres of education, politics, and social reform. Now, this journal was published from May 1903 for 4.5 years. In a short lifespan, it worked as a point of culmination for many of the issues which earlier journals had brought out. And these journals, some of them were from Calcutta, some from smaller places such as Faridpur, Tangail, Sylhet, and so on. So there is a host of places where these journals are being written from, and it is really a new phenomenon at that time. Nour, although attempting to bridge the divide between Hindus and Muslims, insisted on a Muslim identity. It asked Hindus to be as aware of Islam and its culture as Muslims were of Hindu culture and religion. It saw itself as part of a defeated nation comprising both Hindus and Muslims, in whose mutual understanding lay the only hope of the rise of the Indian Bengali nation. The lifespan of Nour thus straddles one of the most significant periods in the history of Bengal. The political movements during this period, including the first partition of Bengal, the birth of the Swadeshi movement, as well as of the Muslim League, emblematize the intense anti-colonial but communal political atmosphere of the age. Shumit Sarkar, for one, characterizes this communal division as the flaw in Indian nationalism as a whole, as its seeds were sown in a divided manner. Nour's first wish to draw Hindu writers into its fold had resulted in acrimonious attacks. Its stated desire to trace another strand of Bengali literary history, which would acknowledge its Muslim presence, could only, within that ambience, be interpreted as divisive. Its efforts to move away from a Musalmani Bangla and to claim its stake in mainstream Bengali writing was bound to end in failure, drawing the ire of both Hindu and Muslim writers. Its most successful effort was to draw women writers into its fold, which was ironically accompanied by vitriolic attacks on the gender politics of both communities. This preoccupation with communal differences, however, overshadowed other divisions that were at work within the Muslim community. It is in this era that the process of gentrification of the Bengali Muslim peasant begins, as the movement of young, educated rural men to cities, to Calcutta, Dhaka, and smaller Mufassal towns testifies. And one of the best descriptions of the pains and of this process is captured in a wonderful novel called Prem Nahi, or There's No Love, published in Calcutta in 1981. So anyway, if anyone feels like reading, that's one of my favorite novels. For the rural educated Muslim, the entry to the Bhadra class, the Bhadra or the Gentile or the Sharif class, was never easy. Colonial history has portrayed the growing class in the Muslim community as a simple distinction between Atraf, the lowly, and Ashraf, the higher class, and the languages they spoke and wrote in. Mobility between rural and urban spaces started to blur these sharp divisions and revealed a more complex social structure. The new middle-educated class chose to write in Bengali, creating the need to establish Bengali as a language for the Muslim masses. In the process, the Bengali language acquired new shapes as it moved from rural to urban spaces, along with a new claim on it by Muslims. Puthis and other forms of Bengali writing that had hitherto resided in the backwaters of rural Bengal now begin to vie for a space in mainstream Bengali language and literature. So this transition has been viewed as progress many a time. And the word progress and lag are associated with this movement and commented on a lot. However, there's a new way of looking at history which is revising or rereading this movement. Iftikhar Iqbal, a historian at Dhaka University, tries to reformulate the meta-narrative of Muslim progress in the early 20th century. Challenging the idea that 19th century Bengal had witnessed the stagnation of Muslim society, he points out that rural Bengal had actually experienced a surge of economic and social benefits. The life of the mid-level peasant as the supplier of raw materials for the British Empire had undergone massive change as new wealth had flowed into rural Bengal. Thus, the new Bengali Muslim of the 20th century, in Iqbal's reading, becomes a victim of mimicry, both communal and colonial. Iqbal shows the dual nature of this mimicry as the Muslim apes the Hindu Bhadralok, who, at this historical juncture, were themselves faced with the limits of native participation in colonial rule. Both through literature and politics, specifically the Swadeshi movement, the Hindu Bhadralok were effecting a return to rural roots. What has been called the Muslim Bengali Renaissance of the early 20th century in this analysis becomes a symptom of a lag. In trying to imitate the middle class, Hindu Bengali Muslims were effectively cutting themselves off from the source of their social, political, and cultural strength. In this process of mimicry, Muslims not only posit the Hindu as the desirable other, but ironically situate themselves in the place of the subject by creating their own others in the form of their rural and uneducated Muslim brothers and forebears. Iqbal's reading of the Muslim migration from the rural to the urban sees it as an unhappy example. Sonia Nishad Amin, who's another historian in Bangladesh, reads the history of the Bhadra Mohila and sees within this move the reformulation of the world of the middle-class Muslim. She describes this as a process of imitation, where the emerging Muslim Bhadra class took as its model the Brahmo of the reformed Hindu. Placed within the colonial public-private divide, Amin also shows how the woman question was debated in various reformist discourses, some overtly Islamic and even fundamentalist, and others more syncretic and modern. The negotiations follow the same path as the earlier Hindu Brahmo, and the Muslim Bhadra Mahila is thus carved in the same mold as her Brahmo sister. Amin's reading of the Muslim woman's journey to modernity allies it with gentrification, placing the new middle-class modern Bengali woman in this nexus. This reading overlooks the exclusions on which the construction of the Bhadra Mohila is based. And if we remind ourselves of what has been left behind and forgotten, we will see that these exclusions were precisely the sites of Muslim strength. And those strengths were the rural connection to the soil, the language which was Bengali and yet not, the way of life which was not cultured but drew on the rivers and land, and these were the hallmarks of rural Bengali Muslim expression. These are the elements which were cast aside into the journey from the rural to the urban, and perhaps dismembered the Bengali writing from its source. The social division in Bengal has also been characterized as the division between the Hindu zamindar and the Muslim peasant. While this characterization can be challenged in many ways, Partha Chatterjee has given us a very detailed explanation of how this equation came about. Peasant politics or organization depend upon a kind of class solidarity from which the newly professionalized Hindu gentry were separated. As peasant political formations developed, and I quote, "What needs to be understood is the social character of the Muslim peasantry, the sense of a peasant community, and the significance of religion in sustaining an ideology of community solidarity, as well as the effects of differentiation within the peasantry. This unified sense of community started to splinter as the newly educated Muslim began to move out of the village, just as the Hindus had done in an earlier era. This move, again, is an imitative one, and in Chatterjee's reading, one that created divisions within the Muslim peasantry. Iqbal has also seen this move as an imitative one, and one which severed Muslims from the source of their political and social sustenance. But to come back to our journals, each of them seems to be involved in this sense of creating a Bengali Muslim identity. And I have quotations from Bongyo Musalman Sahitya Putrika and another one in Saugat. Saugat is very important because it becomes the most prominent of the journals of the time. From this concentration on what the journals were doing, how they were placing women, how they were placing the sense of language and creating it, I would like to turn to looking very briefly at literary criticism and literary writing and tracing of literary histories. While these journals were making a strong claim for the Muslim ownership of the Bengali language, the communal discourse on the language began to acquire a gendered dimension. And I think the gender dimension of it had become clear between the mother and the nurse of the Bengali language. But many Muslim writers says that, you know, the way Muslims are writing is like a matamati of a pahlawan, as though a pahlawan is putting his arms across. And we must learn to be more contained in our writings. So this gendered motive seems to be there, and its claiming its claims is to strengthen the Muslim claim over Bengali. For example, Abul Mansur Ahmad, in an article which translates to literature and contemporaneity, expresses the need for a strong rejuvenated sphere of writing. Writing in 1926, he says, "The contemporary realities of famine, defeat, communal violence, and continuous sacrifice of young lives is not found in Bengali writing." In his tracing of literary writing, he begins, where else, with Bankim Chatterjee, who had envisioned a potential resistance and protest along with the reawakening, and had stressed physical fitness through Anushilan, or exercise, which had both physical and spiritual dimensions. Unfortunately, Mansour says, Bankim had expressed himself in such communal terms that 55% of Bengalis could not respond to his call. Modern Bengali writing follows the exclusive trajectory set down by Bankim. On Tagore, Abul Mansur thinks that his writing lacks a sense of reality and slips into a rarefied and idealized world. So despite his admiration for Bengali literature, he does not think that the contemporary problems can be addressed from within them. He only finds in Qazi Nazrul Islam's writing the ability to meet the challenge of the times, and he says that this is what will revive and renew writing in Bengal. And to quote, he says, "Nazrul's battle drums have effectively woken the lovesick and degenerate Bengali from his sleep." And this emasculated man is always a thing, and the Muslim will come and awaken them somehow. He's confident that this is the kind of writer, Muslim, who will rekindle the Bengali spirit. Based on what he had seen of writers such as Tagore or Sarat Chandra, Abul Mansur turns to Nazrul and says, the responsibility of waking the Bengali nation rests squarely on the shoulders of the Muslim writer. And so even this literary criticism, literary history, a tracing of literary history, tries to bring in the Muslim aspect, but in very gendered terms. I keep on seeing that the gendered terms is what is very interesting. However, even while people were talking about a separate Bengali Muslim stream of writing, the question of why should there be a separate literature is constantly being asked. There's a Sahitya Swatantrata Kano. Why do we need a separate stream of Bengali literature? And writer after writer goes on And there's also a lot of self-criticism and castigation. For example, Abul Fazal says that the Ashraf Bengali who writes in Urdu is cut off from the mainstream Urdu culture of North India, and therefore his writing is artificial and moribund. And the Muslim speaks in a kind of khichdi Bangla, which is neither this nor that. So we have to revive the language even here. Women also entered the sphere of literary criticism, echoing the gendered communal tone of analysis. For example, there's Sufia Khatun, who bemoans the poverty of Bengali Muslim writing in her writing. She says that in spite of the emergence of many journals, literature had not been enriched. Contemporary short stories and novels would ignore social, political, and economic aspects and indulge in writing love stories. And she says that is what is transforming our Bengali youth into dreamy lovers. To quote, this obsession with love will be the downfall of the whole nation. And I think we can recognize the so-called romantic Bengali, or the characterization of the Bengali as romantic. Yes. An interesting article is written by Shamsun Nahar in another journal called Muhammadali in 1939, where she asks the question of what constitutes Bengali Muslim women's literature. Is it a Muslim woman writing, or is it writing about Muslim women? The answer to both questions, she says, has to be in the negative. As far as women writing is concerned, it has not really progressed, she thinks, as women have neither the education nor the tenacity required for the production of literature. But even in male writing, the reflection of women's life is not visible. She's talking in prose fiction. Though there's no dearth of talented Muslim male writers, the softness and sweetness of the inner quarters have not come to life from their pens. Why is this, she asks? She says that unless the curtains to the inner quarters are lifted, it will not be possible to write about what goes on there. The worlds of men and women are so far apart and obscure to each other that one cannot delineate the life of the other. Having said all this, she's still surprised that despite all barriers, some voices from that veiled space have come to life, especially in the works of R.S. Hussain, being Rokia Sakhawat Hussain, Sayyid Jahanara Anwara Chaudhry, and Sufia Khatun. And it's amazing that by 1930s, we have this list of women writers that you can write about. The final point that I would like to make is that this language debate goes over into the debate on the language of education. And this language of education is something that, that we can see was framed under British colonial aegis and was there to spread the light of British education in what in Macaulay's famous minute became known as the filtration theory. And this filtration theory was taken up by Iswar Chandra Vidyasagar, and as we say in Bangla, Bidyasagar, who in 1859, as principal of Sanskrit College, is engaged in fashioning the Bengali medium normal schools, which would be spread all over Bengal. And this is what he says. While fashioning the new Bengali, Vidyasagar says, the first object of those, and this is in English in the original, the first object of those who are entrusted with the superintendence of education in Bengal is the creation of an enlightened Bengali literature. This literature can only be formed by the exertions of those who are competent to collect the materials from European sources and to dress them in elegant, expressive Bengali. Further, Vidyasagar goes on to say that an elegant and expressive and idiomatic Bengali style cannot be at the command of those who are not good Sanskrit scholars. This modern Bengali, envisaged by Vidyasagar, and which became the language of the literary efflorescence of the mid-19th century Bengal, is obviously constructed based on an amalgamation of European knowledge and Sanskrit rhetoric. Not only is it separate from all versions of the language spoken in Bengal, it is formed with a colonial agenda to spread the light of Western thought, where the constructed language would only be the elegant Bengali dress. And it is within this context that the language debate above can be looked at, and we could also, extend it to look at the language of education, because this is the official version of what the language of education would be. There is a lot of debate and discussion in the pages of these journals of why the Bengali Muslim was staying away from English education. Many a time it was said that what was being taught was so alien, and the Sanskrit base of that was as equally alien as the English or scientific aspect of it. It's an interesting and interesting debate, but I would like to end with an article by Khairunisa Khatun again, who ran a small village school for village girls. And in her writing, which also she published in Nobunur, the main concern seems to be with money rather than anything else. So all these debates on language, education, literature, when it comes back to women, I've noticed that these practical aspects get more. Women need to go ahead, women need to. So I think there's something to look at there. So in this context, we can look at women writing on educational concerns. And it is interesting to see how women's concerns are part of looking at education, parda, and poverty. And something I'm not going to get into parda at all. The best example of such writing is by Khairunisa Khatun, who ran a small girls' school in the small eastern Bengal town of Sirajganj. She had drawn attention to the need for all women to be educated, regardless of wealth and class or location, thus making education the social bridge between all forms of division, class, or communal. Parda in her writing is neither castigated nor lauded. It is perceived as a reality in the lives of Muslim girls and women. Given the lack of mobility that this entails, she calls for the establishment of schools that would be accessible to girls within Parda. Along with physical accessibility is one of financial affordability. Muslims in Bengal were poor and could hardly afford to educate their sons. In this situation, it is futile to hope that they would invest in girls' education. Muslim efforts to establish schools had not matched Hindu initiatives, and she laments that even when there were private initiatives for the establishment of free schools, such as her own, there was no support forthcoming from the Muslim community to sustain such efforts. She brings in the rural dimension and calls for the establishment of girls' schools and villages. She makes a difference between city and village schools. On the point of funding, she found it was easier to collect funds in cities, as a large number of prosperous Muslims lived there, while village schools were constantly faced a financial crunch. Furthermore, she talks about the greater availability of women teachers in urban areas. This is why she recommends women teachers of good characters in favorably located schools which girls could attend without breaking the norms of Parda. To respect this, men, she said, were to be prohibited from the school premises. Girls attending such schools could come in groups or be accompanied by a maid, and older girls would be provided transportation. In village schools, beset as they were by financial problems, sincere, older, and experienced Muslim male teachers would have to be recruited, as educated Muslim women teachers probably would not be available. This was the best possible arrangement, although it would prevent many older girls from attending. Meaningful social progress depended on the education of younger girls, and educating them would eventually bring positive social changes. It is interesting to note the strategies that women adopt to put forward their cause. We have seen how Rokia falls back on Muslim precepts even while criticizing Muslim society. Khairunisa's writing is much more secular in tone, but in order to gain her ends, she is willing to comply with Muslim social norms that would take girls to school. So along with these host of problems, which I hope that we will be able to explore through the debate on language, the language of education, the language of writing, the language of literature, a literary tradition, we hope to trace the cultural placement and history of women in Muslim Bengal. Thank you. I hope I didn't overstep that. No. Perfect timing, 50 minutes.
I really enjoyed that. It's a very rich project. Thank you. With lots of dimensions to explore, I agree with you. And it reminds me of, I'm more familiar with the Punjab side. But I found myself wondering at times, not with every writer, certainly not so much with Khairun Nisa, but with the others, whether if one had replaced the term nation, the region, that would have been a slightly different emphasis on the tension between, let's say, the Muslim community, the language, and some sort of, let's call it a geopolitical imagination or a spatial imagination that might have been not the nation, not coterminous with the nation itself, but rather with Bengal or with however Bengal. I mean, one could almost draw the line of Bengal by reading these articles.
I did think of Bengal, but I thought of Bengal as the nation. You know? So maybe that's where the conflation is happening. But yes, it is a very the struggle we are tracing is a very Bengali struggle, in the sense that we need to be placed within the mainstream of Bengali writing, thinking, nation-making, politics, etc. But there is a way that we are not being, and how do we, without, there's at one level the lag and the catching up, but I would like to read that there is no desire to catch up, as it were, but to establish a difference which would then be included and inclusive. Yes, and one of the things that is being read is that there has always been a language debate, because even up to 1952, before the language movement started, there was a debate about the communal nature of the language. Which one is our language? How do we establish our language? And this, I think, has to be knitted in with the other things that were happening with Bengali modernist literature, where we were writing in Promito Bhasha, in spoken language, rather than the written form, and a more colloquial written form of Bengali was entering all forms of Bengali writing, even in Tagore's writing, etc. And the debate ended actually in Pakistan, because the debate of which Bengali, what kind of Bengali, stopped. It just became a Bengali versus Urdu kind of a thing. But this traces it back to a period where we were actually debating the status of the language itself. Does that answer the question?
Thank you very much. That was a really fascinating talk, and I hope we get to talk a little more, because I work on very much the similar time period that you are, but I look at Hindu Vaishnava journals that were written and coming out of Calcutta at the same time. And I really like Will's question, because in some ways it speaks to some of the things that I have been struggling with in my own research, is exactly how to think about the idea of the nation in Bengali writings at this time. And I, of course, come from the majoritarian side, or at least what's being projected as the majoritarian side of the debate, where clearly the nation is being imagined in Hindu terms at this time. And as I said, I work on Vaishnava stuff, so Chaitanya is a very important figure. And what struck out to me particularly in your talk was this one intellectual who was writing in the journal that you were talking about, and he spoke about Bengali literary modernity to be traced back to the times of the Muslim kings. And I was wondering if you could shed a little more light on that. What's fascinating in, of course, my own research is precisely the quantity and the amount of Vaishnava literature that was being produced in Bengal, that is, Bengal of the sultans. And how exactly is that literature being talked about in these journals? That's one of my questions. And the other one was, I was just curious about what is the relationship between these journals and these new institutions that are coming up, like the Bongyo Sahitya Parishad, which is also established in 1890.
No, but the Bengali Muslim Sahitya Parishad is established later.
I was curious about that you mentioned. So I guess those are kind of, if you could talk a little more about that, I was curious.
Okay, in my reading so far in the journals, the literary renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries talks about the variety of writings that period produced, but specifically talks about an Islamic reading of puthis. You know what puthis are. They're like ballads, supposedly oral literature, but what were written down, of stories such as Yusuf Zulekha, Laila Majnu, and all of that stuff, which combined what has become known as Dobhashi or Musulmani Bengali, which combined Persian and Arabic words with the Bengali. And even in our literary training, we were taught to look upon it as artificial, as something that was constructed. But these journals claimed that the new words were being infused into the Bengali language, and a new dimension was being added. So far in my reading, I have not come across. And thank you for pointing it out, because what do they say about the rich Vaishnava literature that is being created immediately at that same period? And about the literary societies and the various societies that were being formed, in our reading, again, the formation of the Muslim League, actually in 1905, 1906, gave a political platform, but then was immediately accompanied by the Krishak Praja Party and all these other political parties. And the literary societies and journals came as part of these political moves. And I think the earlier societies, besides some very elite, like Nawab Abdul Latif in Calcutta, who were part of these earlier organizations, I don't think any of our writers were part of that. So there was literally, the construction of new spaces taking place at that time. I think the Vaishnava thing is something we have to look into and look out for references.
Some quid pro quo necessary. Catherine and then Ruma.
Thank you for your talk, and I'm really an outsider, so this question may come from left field. But I'm curious about, you talk about, language of education, a language of modernity, a language of nation or of Bengal. And I'm wondering what's happening as far as transformations in a language of love, and is in a creation of love and nation and sister and brother and new citizen. You mentioned Layla and Majnun. Are some of these older epics also mobilized in order to create a very different kind of language of community and nation?
In the language of the effective language of novels, etc., it's also the great age of the Bengali writing of all kinds. The great Tagore lived during this period, and we all learn to fall in love through Tagore, whether it's love of language, love of another human being, or, I think the Bengali sensibility has been created through that kind of literature. But at the same time, these novels that you have are also very like moralistic texts, which show you ways of behavior, the new man and the new woman. So there is a change. There is a strong awareness and self-consciousness that we are living in a new world, and new forms of being and effective domestic relationships have to be formed within that. And there is an Islamic discourse that comes in, because there are a lot of writings about the place of women, the love in a family, in a marriage, and they are very influential, especially in the lives of women. And so there is many kinds of writings that come in to make the effective world of the Bengali, the modern Bengali at that time. Therefore, it is very interesting to trace writings by women and the early novels by women, to see how they are looking at love, life, family. I don't think they go as far as sex, but yes.
So again, you just wait for the mic that way. Thank you.
Also, as an outsider, Actually, I just had a clarification first. What was the time, this journal that you, Nobunur?
Nobunur.
Nobunur, that you, when
1903 to 1907.
Okay, so to me it's surprising that there was this emphasis and a call for women's writing.
Yeah.
So what was the origin? They seem to have been
But it's not isolated. The other journals that I refer to have similar calls. And in fact, Saugat, which comes out in 1928, about 20 years later, but starts a Mohila Saugat, immediately a woman's writing. So there is an awareness that the place of women in the emerging nation community, Bengal, the place of women in Islam, it's contested. It's something that women are unable to deal with. The community itself is struggling with it. I suppose that is why calling on women to write. And there is a group of women who are learning to read and write, and each of them have their own very unique stories of how they learned to read and write. And as has Khairun-Nisa, as has Rokia, the women I've been quoting from. And they've not had formal schooling, but some form of education has seeped into beyond the Quran and learning how to say your prayers, etc.
So they seem to have been about 100 years ahead of Western science.
Maybe.
So was this journal dedicated to women's writings, or no?
No. Dedicated to all writing, I suppose.
I'm going to take the question here, and then Hafsa.
I was wondering if it seems that I guess I was wondering if you think that the emphasis of Muslim writers in Bangla was kind of like a contributor to the like almost, I guess, finalization of the difference between Western Bengal and Eastern Bengal as being like Hindu versus Muslim. Do you think that that had any influence, like the emphasis of we need to bring Muslim writers into Bangla?
It wasn't as much as East versus West Bengal or Muslim versus. It wasn't Muslim versus. It was perhaps Muslims versus, but it's Muslim in Bengal. But it was also about rural into urban Bengal. So, because the claim being made here that rural Bengal is rich. It has a lot of stories. It has ways of expressing itself. And that is what must be brought into mainstream Bengali writing, that we must tap those sources. So there's a kind of romantic thing as well, getting that rural base into the mainstream. But as they do it, it seems that there is more and more a disconnect between the rural and the middle class urban as they go on. Yes, but I think there is a kind of romanticizing the rural Bengal Muslim here as well.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My question is, I was wondering how these Muslim writers in the earlier 20th century situated themselves in relation to the Muslim reform movements of the late 19th century, because the latter was also interested in asserting a Bengali Muslim identity, but the emphasis on the language wasn't there. In fact, they wanted Muslims to sort of distance themselves from the Bengali language. So did these writers in the early 20th century, did they explicitly blame these Muslim reform movements for the lag of the Bengali Muslim community?
I don't know whether there's something of blame, but they separated themselves from it. They actually said that it has to be a Bengali movement, that we have to stake our claim on Bengali, on the language of Bengal, on Bengali writing, and that this reform, they're also talking of reform, will have to come in Bengali. So there is a class dimension to it. This is the new Bengali. This is not the Ashraf of the 19th century. This is the newly educated, small-town, rural Bengali starting to express themselves in various ways. And not just in these journals, but even politically. So, that why the Muslim League then doesn't become the party for the Bengali Muslims, and you have the Krishok Proja League. The Krishok Proja, Krishok means the farmer, kisan. Proja means the serf. That's the party. So there's a class dimension to it that brings Bengali in. So in this class dimension, you're separating yourself from the older Muslims, gentry, from the Hindu Bhadralok gentry. You are making a strong class claim here that we are. But as you're doing that, are you becoming that, is the question that we have to ask ourselves.
In the context that I'm a little more familiar with, some of what you've described has really strong parallels, especially the rural-urban divide that you're mapping, especially with wealth, sort of new wealth and new forms of capital circulating within rural Tamil Nadu in that case. And in that case, too, there was a very interesting literary sort of production happening, except the call for women's writing and the call for literary production to emerge from rural parts was quickly fissured by caste considerations.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious about whether the call for women's rights had to deal with other kinds of internal fissures within a sphere of women's literary production, or was it mostly just a class and to some extent a communal issue, or were there other sorts of fragments they had to deal with?
In the case of women, I think in all through, it's more a thing of communal. That is, Muslim women come out and write, say where Muslim women are placed, talk about it. Or the Muslim woman must come out of from behind the veil. This is the kind of spirit that these journals represent, rather than a fear or something else. I mean, there is a sense of beleagueredness, being at bay all the time. So it's not a very dominant section that is writing, but someone that people who are always kind of being attacked or being sidelined or have not been considered the mainstream, and trying to forge another space, all of us together, or maybe make entries, forays into the mainstream itself. That's what I think.
I want to take the prerogative to ask a question if I can, and then certainly. So, I mean, there's so many things I would like to ask you about, but the standard, the normative Bengali literary modernity that you highlighted for us, you did make the point that, of course, it starts with Bankim, right? So there is this kind of clearly a normative within both historiography and in literary criticism, a very clear sense of what Bengali modernity is that has a genealogy, right? Ram Mohan Roy, and then the literary modernity of Bankim. And as you yourself have pointed out, that there's this amazing slippage between that Bengali modernity and the nation, right? But leaving that issue aside for a moment, I wonder if you could just underscore how the Bengali modernity of Hussein or of Khairunisa, who seems like an amazing character who I don't know about, a historical figure, how does the Bengali modernity of these women writers look different from the Bengali modernity? Or maybe if I reframe the question, would you be comfortable using the term, in this context of these writers, using the term Muslim modernity, and how does this Muslim modernity look different from that standard normative kind of Bengali modernity that you seem to be pushing against in all of these different ways?
I don't know that I'd feel comfortable with using the word Muslim modernity, because a lot of these people resist Muslim strictures and norms and in their writing. So I don't know that it is a Muslim modernity as either. Maybe I'm reading too much into these women. I'm not quite sure at this point. But I really think that there's a liberationary tone to women writing from Muslim Bengal, at least the women I'm looking at, which goes beyond what the Nobanur editorial calls for, or which goes beyond what was expected, and talks about, well, use your brains, don't read the Quran, use your brains, God has given that to you. and go ahead and do your things. So what, men won't marry you? Go ahead and be yourself. So this kind of thing in 1903 and 1904 is quite amazing. And from people who have grown up in Rangpur, Sirajganj, you know, they're really... So there is perhaps more to be done on the social positioning of women, the kinds of education they received, and maybe the so-called Hindu criticism is justified in a way that they are, forging a path of their own, regardless of what is around them. They're very amazing pieces of writing in that sense, very inspiring, liberationary, calling on people to break all norms and things. So I don't know how Muslim it is, in a way. I don't know what Muslim modernity does look like.
Right. No, I mean, Hussein is, of course, revolutionary, and as Ruma's point, in really global feminist terms. Hussein is just so far out there and far and beyond. But you had a question in the front.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the number and range of the circulation of these periodicals.
The number is amazing. There were, I haven't made a talika or list yet, but till the 1930s, new journals were coming out, at least 2 new journals per year. So the ones in Calcutta, Shaugat, for instance, remained till the 1950s and was read in every household, middle-class household of Bengal. But there were a range of journals coming out from the smaller cities, from the smaller towns, Sylhet for one. And I have these things from the Sylheti journal, which, you know, debates the whole issue of parda. And, it's a very conservative journal, but there are women writing and saying all kinds of things about parda. So it does have a depth also. It's not just the newly minted Bhadralok who's reading it, but the newly minted Bhadralok and Mohila even in the small towns. So that is something that needs to be looked into.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I wanted to follow up on your question in a way, because I was wondering about the relationship between these nationally or religiously or even regionally constituted communities and feminism as a kind of imaginary. Because it seems to me that even while nationalists are very concerned about their women and other people's women, women who are writing in this period are not always so concerned about the nation, right?
Yes.
And they understand woman subordination as what we all have in common. And I heard a little bit of that when you were talking about Rokia Begum drawing on Turkey and so forth. And so I'm wondering, do you see this story unfolding in the Bengali Muslim context as well, where certain periodicals, perhaps led by men, want a particularly Bengali Muslim woman's writing, and these women write as women?
I think that's exactly what's happening, that they want Bengali women's writing to have the notion of nation and to contribute to that. But these women are writing as women and are looking for sources of inspiration and from each other rather than buying into or contributing to this notion of nation or Bengalihood, as it were. Yeah, I agree with you completely. That's what's happening. They're going beyond what they were meant to do.
Just curious about one thing. Were there any women who wrote as men before they actually identified themselves as women? In Tagore, you find characters who are writing, articles in nationalist newspapers. But were there any women who kind of wrote under?
No, I haven't come across any male pseudonym. No. No, I haven't.
Please join me in thanking Professor Azim.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It was a real pleasure.